Elena Morales wiped the sweat from her brow as she polished the grand piano in the corner of the Henderson family's massive living room. The spring sun poured through tall windows, making the already warm room even hotter as she worked. 6 months she had been cleaning for this family, and still they barely noticed her beyond giving orders or pointing out spots she'd missed. The gleaming black piano stood as a showpiece more than an instrument. In all her time working here, Elena had never once seen anyone play it. She ran her cloth over the smooth surface one last time, fighting the urge to lift the cover and touch the keys underneath. "Don't even think about it," she whispered to herself. "You need this job." The sound of laughter drifted in from the garden where Mrs. Henderson was planning their annual charity gala with her event coordinator. Elena had been cleaning since dawn to prepare the house for the stream of planners, caterers, and decorators who would be coming and going all week before Saturday's big event. "We simply must have live music, darling." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried through the open French doors. Something elegant but not too serious. The Wellington party last month had that dreadful string quartet that put half the guests to sleep. Elena smiled to herself as she moved to dust the family photos displayed on the mantelpiece. The pictures showed the perfect American family. Mr. Henderson in his expensive suits, Mrs. Henderson always dressed to impress, their teenage daughter, Brittany, looking bored but beautiful, and their son, Tyler, showing off sports trophies. The front door slammed and Elena jumped slightly. Brittany Henderson strutted in with 3 friends, all wearing their private school uniforms but somehow making them look like fashion statements. They dropped their designer bags on the floor that Elena had just mopped. "Mom, we're home," Brittany called out before noticing Elena. "Oh, you're still here." Elena nodded politely. "Yes, miss, I'm finishing the living room now." Brittany barely acknowledged her, turning to her friends instead. "Let's go upstairs. I got those new shoes I told you about." One of the girls, Zoe, Elena thought her name was, pointed to the piano. "Hey, isn't your mom freaking out about finding a pianist for the party? My mom said yours called her in a panic." Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically. "Ugh, yes. Our usual guy canceled because of some family emergency. Mom's been on the phone all morning trying to find someone else fancy enough for her precious guests." The girls headed toward the stairs, but paused when Mrs. Henderson walked in from the garden. "Girls, how was school?" she asked, her perfect smile never reaching her eyes. She glanced at Elena. "Are you almost finished in here? The florist will be arriving soon to discuss arrangements." "Yes, ma'am. Just a few more minutes," Elena replied quietly. Mrs. Henderson nodded absently before turning her attention back to her daughter. "Brittany, darling, I've been calling around all morning, but finding a replacement pianist on such short notice is proving impossible. Everyone good is already booked." "Mom, it's just background music. No one actually listens to it anyway," Brittany said with a shrug. Another girl, Ashley, suddenly laughed. "Hey, what about her?" She nodded toward Elena, who was carefully putting the family photos back in their exact positions. "Wouldn't that be hilarious? She probably doesn't even know which end of the piano to sit at." The girls giggled, and Elena kept her eyes down, pretending not to hear. She had learned early on that being invisible was the safest option in this house. "Don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Henderson said, though her lips curled into a slight smile at the joke. "We need a professional." The conversation moved on as Elena finished her work in the living room and quietly slipped away to clean the downstairs bathroom. As she scrubbed the already spotless sink, her mind wandered to the piano. How long had it been since she'd touched one? 7 years? No, closer to 8 now. The days passed quickly as the gala approached. Elena worked longer hours helping to prepare the house for the big event. She polished silver, washed crystal, glasses, and moved furniture to create the perfect flow for the party. All the while, she heard snippets of conversation about the pianist problem. By Friday afternoon, panic had set in. Mr. Henderson arrived home from work to find his wife on the phone, her voice tight with stress. "What do you mean he's double booked? The party is tomorrow." Mrs. Henderson hung up and turned to her husband. "That's the third one who's canceled or isn't available. At this point, we'll have to use recorded music. which is so common. Mr. Henderson loosened his tie and poured himself a drink from the bar cart. What about that jazz quartet we heard at the Thompsons' party? Booked for a wedding in the Hamptons, she replied, sinking onto the couch. Elena moved quietly around them, collecting empty coffee cups and straightening magazines. Neither of them seemed to notice her presence. That evening, as Elena was finishing her tasks before heading home, she heard raised voices from upstairs. Brittany was arguing with her mother about attending the gala. It's going to be so boring. Just a bunch of old people talking about their stock portfolios and charity projects they don't actually care about. This is important for your father's business connections, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. And one day these will be your connections too. Now, which dress are you wearing? The blue Chanel or the green Dior? Elena slipped out the back door to catch her bus. Her tiny apartment was a far cry from the Henderson mansion, but it was clean and it was hers. She made herself a simple dinner and sat down at her small table, eating alone as she did most nights. After washing her dishes, she walked to her bedroom where the only luxury she owned sat in the corner, a digital keyboard she'd bought secondhand when she first arrived in the country. It wasn't nearly the same as a real piano, but it kept her fingers nimble. She rarely turned it on, though. Playing brought back too many memories, too much pain. But tonight, she felt drawn to it. She sat down on the bench and switched it on, putting the headphones over her ears so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the music flowed through her like a forgotten friend returning. When she finally stopped, tears were streaming down her face. She wiped them away quickly and turned off the keyboard. Tomorrow would be a long day and she needed her rest. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for the gala. Elena was at the Henderson house by 6, helping the caterers set up in the kitchen and making sure everything was spotless for the guests who would arrive at 7 that evening. By late afternoon, Mrs. Henderson was still fretting about the music. Perhaps we could stream something through the sound system, she suggested to her husband, who was more concerned with making sure the bar was properly stocked. No one will care, dear, he assured her. They're coming for the free booze and to show off their new jewelry, not for a concert. Elena kept her head down as she arranged fresh flowers throughout the house. The piano stood silent in the corner of the room, its surface gleaming from her careful polishing. Little did she know how that piano would change everything in just a few hours' time. The Henderson home transformed as evening approached. Twinkling lights lined the garden paths and flowers filled every corner of the house. Elena had changed into her serving uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, and stood in the kitchen with the catering staff, ready to help serve drinks and appetizers. Remember, circulate constantly but remain invisible, the head caterer instructed the serving team. These people don't want to see you unless they need something. Elena nodded along with the others. She was good at being invisible. It was how she had survived all these years. The first guests arrived precisely at 7. Elena watched from the kitchen as beautiful people in expensive clothes air-kissed and complimented each other's outfits. Mrs. Henderson floated among them in a stunning red gown, her diamond necklace catching the light with every movement. Start with the champagne trays, the caterer ordered, and Elena picked up a silver tray of filled glasses, balancing it carefully as she stepped into the growing crowd. Thank you, murmured one older gentleman as he took a glass, one of the few who actually looked at her face. Most guests simply reached for the drinks without pausing their conversations. The room grew louder as more guests arrived. Elena moved efficiently through the crowd, her tray never empty for long. She passed by the piano several times and noticed Mrs. Henderson explaining to various guests about the unfortunate situation with the pianist. We had Jacques Romano booked, but he canceled at the last minute, she said to a couple who Elena recognized as the Whitfields from previous parties. Some family emergency in Europe. Such a shame, Mrs. Whitfield replied. Live music adds such ambiance. By 8:30, the party was in full swing. The house was packed with Boston's wealthiest families, all mingling and drinking and pretending to care about whatever charity this gala was supposedly supporting. Elena had overheard enough conversations to gather it had something to do with arts education for underprivileged children, which struck her as ironic, given how these same people treated actual underprivileged individuals like herself. Elena was refilling her tray with fresh champagne flutes when Brittany and her friends burst into the kitchen, giggling and slightly tipsy despite being underage. "I'm so bored," Brittany complained, grabbing a stuffed mushroom from a tray waiting to go out. "Dad's business friends are all ancient and Mom won't stop talking about the missing pianist. We should provide some entertainment ourselves," suggested Ashley, the same girl who had made the joke about Elena days earlier. She hadn't recognized Elena in her uniform or simply didn't remember her. "Like what?" Zoe asked, snagging a glass of champagne when the caterer's back was turned. Ashley's eyes lit up with mischief. "I have the best idea. You know how your mom is so upset about not having a pianist? What if we pretended the maid was the backup?" The girls dissolved into giggles while Elena froze, her back to them as she arranged glasses on her tray. "Oh my God, that would be hilarious," Brittany said between laughs. "Dad's totally had enough to drink that he might actually announce it." "Let's do it," Ashley urged. "Tell him the agency sent her as a replacement but she just got here or something." The girls hurried out of the kitchen, still laughing, and Elena felt her stomach knot with dread. Surely they wouldn't actually go through with such a cruel joke, and surely Mr. Henderson wouldn't believe such a ridiculous story. She continued serving drinks, hoping the girls would forget their prank idea, but 15 minutes later she saw Brittany whispering in her father's ear. Mr. Henderson, red-faced from several scotches, looked surprised, then amused. He nodded and patted his daughter's shoulder. Elena tried to make herself even more invisible, sticking to the edges of the room, but it was too late. Mr. Henderson was tapping a spoon against his glass, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment," he called out, his words slightly slurred. The room gradually quieted. "My lovely wife has been distraught all week because our pianist canceled, but I'm pleased to announce that the agency has sent us a last-minute replacement." Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "They did? You didn't tell me." "She just arrived," Mr. Henderson continued, waving away his wife's questions. "And she's ready to provide us with some beautiful music for the evening." Brittany and her friends were huddled in a corner, barely containing their laughter. Elena tried to slip into the kitchen, but Ashley spotted her and pointed. "There she is!" the girl called out. All eyes turned to Elena, who stood frozen with her now empty tray. Her heart pounded in her chest as Mr. Henderson waved her over. Come, he said jovially. "Don't be shy, the piano awaits." "Robert, what are you doing?" Mrs. Henderson whispered urgently. "That's our maid, not a pianist." "The agency sent her," he insisted, the alcohol making him stubborn. "Brittany just told me." Mrs. Henderson glanced at her daughter, who was trying to maintain an innocent expression despite the giggles escaping her lips. Understanding dawned on her face, but before she could intervene, Mr. Henderson had crossed the room and taken Elena by the elbow. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our pianist for the evening," he announced, guiding a mortified Elena toward the grand piano. The crowd watched with curious expressions. Some looked embarrassed for her, others amused. Phones appeared in hands, ready to capture what they assumed would be an awkward and entertaining failure. "Robert," Mrs. Henderson hissed, "this isn't funny. Stop it right now." But her husband was enjoying his role as master of ceremonies too much to stop. "Come now, everyone deserves a chance to shine. Isn't that what our charity is all about? Arts education for all?" He guided Elena to the piano bench and gestured for her to sit. She stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation. The room had gone quiet except for a few whispers and the occasional muffled laugh from Brittany's corner. I'm not," Elena started to say, but her voice was barely audible. "Play something simple," Mr. Henderson encouraged, his hand still on her shoulder. "Just a little background music." Elena looked around the room at all the expectant faces. Mrs. Henderson looked mortified. Brittany and her friends were barely containing their glee, and the rest of the guests were watching with expressions ranging from second-hand embarrassment to cruel amusement. For a brief moment, Elena considered running from the room. She could quit, find another job, avoid the humiliation they were so eager to inflict. But something inside her shifted as she looked at the piano. Slowly, she sat down on the bench. The room seemed to hold its breath as she adjusted her position and stared at the keys before her. The black and white pattern was so familiar, yet it had been so long since she'd touched a real piano, not just her small keyboard at home. "This should be good," someone whispered, not quietly enough. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she placed them in position. She could feel Brittany and her friends watching, waiting for her to fumble and embarrass herself. She could sense Mrs. Henderson's discomfort and Mr. Henderson's drunken amusement. But as her fingers hovered over the keys, a strange calm settled over her. This moment of intended humiliation suddenly felt like something else entirely, an opportunity she never thought she'd have again. She took a deep breath and looked up at the crowd one last time, their expectant faces all blurred together as she focused inward, remembering who she used to be before life had forced her to become invisible. Then, Elena closed her eyes and pressed down on the first key. The single note hung in the air, pure, perfect, and powerful. Elena felt the familiar ivory beneath her fingertips, so different from her plastic keyboard at home. The crowd's whispers faded as she struck that first note, and in that moment she made a decision. She would not play something simple. She would not give them the awkward performance they expected. Her fingers moved across the keys with sudden confidence, launching into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece began softly, almost tentatively, like a question being asked. Then it built, note by note, into something undeniable. Elena felt the years of silence falling away. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget: the countless hours of practice, the competitions, the standing ovations. Before she became a maid, before she became invisible, she had been someone else entirely. The room had gone completely silent now. Through half-opened eyes, Elena caught glimpses of shocked faces. Brittany's smirk had vanished. Mrs. Henderson stood with her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Mr. Henderson had stumbled back a step, his self-satisfied expression replaced with pure astonishment. But Elena no longer cared about their reactions. The music had taken her somewhere else, back to concert halls and music schools, back to when her identity had been wrapped up in the sounds she could create with her hands. The piece grew more complex, her fingers flying across the keys in runs and trills that required years of training to execute properly. The Chopin Ballade was a piece that told a story without words, beginning with that questioning melody, building through conflict and struggle, and ending in passionate intensity. It was a piece she had performed in her final recital at the conservatory, before everything fell apart. She knew it by heart, every note etched into her muscle memory. As she played, Elena's body swayed with the music. Her feet found the pedals, instinctively, adding depth and resonance to the sound that filled the Hendersons' massive living room. The magnificent grand piano, which had sat unused for so long, sang under her touch, responding to her with a richness her small keyboard at home could never produce. She didn't hold back. Each crescendo rose and fell like waves, the complex emotions of the piece flowing through her and into the music. Chopin had written this ballade to evoke feelings of longing, of homesickness, of dreams deferred. All emotions Elena knew intimately. The piece built toward its thunderous conclusion, her hands flying across the keyboard with precision and passion. When the final notes resounded through the room, Elena kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, not wanting to break the spell, not ready to return to reality. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then came a single gasp, followed by another. When Elena finally opened her eyes and looked up, she saw expressions of wonder, confusion, and even tears on some faces. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at the woman they had only known as the maid, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Mr. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Mrs. Henderson had pressed a hand to her chest, her perfectly made-up face showing genuine emotion for once, and Brittany, the architect of this intended humiliation, stood frozen in shock, her phone still raised but forgotten in her hand. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly, the entire room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their faces transformed with genuine appreciation. Elena sat still, overwhelmed by the response, unused to being the center of attention after so many years of trying to disappear. An older gentleman pushed his way forward through the crowd. Elena recognized him as Dr. Reed, a regular guest at Henderson parties who had always nodded politely to the staff, one of the few who seemed to actually see them. "My dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" Before Elena could answer, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her composure somewhat recovered. "I had no idea," she said, her voice unusually genuine. "Why didn't you tell us you could play?" Elena stood from the piano bench, smoothing her uniform with shaking hands. "You never asked," she said simply. The crowd pressed closer, faces filled with questions. Elena felt the weight of their attention, so different from their usual disregard. "Where did you study?" someone called out. "The National Conservatory," Elena replied, her voice growing slightly stronger. "In my home country." "She was a child prodigy," Dr. Reed said suddenly, studying her face more carefully. "Elena Morales, isn't it? I thought you looked familiar. I attended a concert in Vienna about 8 years ago. You played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Philharmonic." Elena felt heat rise to her face. "Yes, that was me," she confirmed quietly. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone toward the back whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Why is she working as a maid?" Elena looked down at her hands that had once brought audiences to their feet. Now rough from cleaning chemicals and hard work, how could she explain the political upheaval that had forced her to flee her country? The visa limitations that prevented her from working in her field? The desperate need for any job that would pay her bills while she built a new life in a strange country? Mrs. Henderson seemed to sense Elena's discomfort, perhaps feeling guilty about what had nearly become a cruel joke at Elena's expense. She stepped in. "I think we could all use another drink," she announced to the crowd. "And perhaps if she's willing, Elena might play something else for us later." The guests reluctantly dispersed, moving back toward the bar and the food tables, though many kept glancing back at Elena with newfound respect and curiosity. Brittany and her friends had disappeared completely, probably hiding from the backfired consequences of their prank. Elena stood by the piano, unsure what to do next. Should she return to serving drinks as if nothing had happened? The thought seemed impossible now. Something fundamental had shifted in the air of the Henderson home. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Henderson said quietly when they were relatively alone. "My daughter, I had no idea they were planning such a thoughtless joke." Elena nodded, accepting the apology but not quite trusting herself to speak. The rush of playing again, really playing on a magnificent instrument, had left her emotionally raw. "Why didn't you ever mention you were a pianist?" Mrs. Henderson asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Elena looked at her employer directly. "Would it have mattered? You hired me to clean your home, not to play your piano." Mrs. Henderson had the grace to look embarrassed. "I suppose you're right," she admitted. "Still, it seems such a waste of talent." Before Elena could respond, Mr. Henderson appeared at his wife's side, considerably more sober than he had been 20 minutes earlier. "That was unexpected," he said, looking at Elena with new eyes. "You play beautifully." "Thank you, sir," Elena replied formally. An awkward silence fell between them. For 6 months, they had barely exchanged more than brief instructions and polite acknowledgments. Now they seemed to be seeing each other as actual people for the first time. Would you play something else?" Mr. Henderson asked, finally. "The guests are asking. Of course we'd pay you extra," he added hastily. "As a performer, not as..." Well, you know. Elena considered the request. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity she had left in this situation, but another part, the part that had come alive again at the piano, longed to continue playing. "I'd be happy to play again," she said finally. "But I'd like to change first, if that's all right." Mrs. Henderson brightened. "Of course, you can borrow something of mine. We're about the same size." 15 minutes later, Elena returned to the piano wearing a simple but elegant black dress borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's closet. Her hair was down from its usual tight bun, and she'd washed the makeup from her face in the guest bathroom. She looked different, more like the person she used to be before life had forced her to become someone else. As she took her seat at the piano again, the crowd gathered around expectantly, their attention focused on her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. This time there was no mockery in their gaze, only anticipation. Elena placed her fingers on the keys and began to play again, choosing Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece of ethereal beauty that seemed to capture the strange, transformative mood of the evening. As the gentle, dreamlike notes filled the room, Elena felt something long dormant awakening inside her. For the first time in years, she was visible again. The charity gala that had begun as an ordinary society event had transformed into something entirely unexpected. Elena played for nearly an hour, moving from Debussy to Beethoven to Gershwin. Each piece met with genuine appreciation from the gathered crowd. The guests who had earlier looked through her now watched in awe, many recording snippets on their phones to share on social media. During a brief pause between pieces, Dr. Reed approached the piano again. "You must tell us your story," he said gently. "How does someone with your extraordinary talent end up—" He trailed off, too polite to finish the thought. Elena's hands rested lightly on the keys. The room had quieted, everyone leaning in to hear her response. She had spent years avoiding personal questions, keeping her past locked away, but tonight something had broken open inside her. "I was born in a small village," she began, her voice soft but clear. "My father was a music teacher at the local school. We had an old upright piano that he'd salvaged and repaired himself. He noticed I could play back any melody I heard, even before I could reach the pedals." She smiled at the memory. "By 6, I was playing Bach. By 10, I was winning regional competitions. The National Conservatory offered me a full scholarship when I was 12, and I moved to the capital city to study." Her fingers absently played a few quiet notes as she spoke. "For years, music was my whole life. I performed with orchestras across Europe. There were talks of an international tour." Elena paused, the light notes fading. The room remained silent, hanging on her words. "Then came the revolution," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "My country's government changed overnight. The new regime considered classical music elitist and foreign-influenced. The conservatory was shut down. Musicians were viewed with suspicion." She looked up at the gathered faces, seeing real interest rather than the polite boredom these people usually displayed. "My father was arrested for organizing a community concert. My mother and I were told we were on a watch list. Friends disappeared. We knew we had to leave." Her fingers found the keys again, playing a melancholy melody that underscored her words. "We fled with almost nothing. My father had arranged false papers for us, but he couldn't come himself. He said he would follow when he could." She swallowed hard. "That was 7 years ago. I haven't heard from him since." Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes. Even Brittany, who had slipped back into the room, looked ashamed of her earlier cruelty. "My mother and I made it to Turkey, then applied for refugee status. We waited 2 years in a camp before being accepted to come here. My mother—" Elena's voice caught. "She developed pneumonia in the camp. She didn't recover." The beautiful room was utterly silent now, except for Elena's gentle playing. "When I arrived here, my conservatory education meant nothing. My refugee status limited where I could work. I took what jobs I could find: dishwasher, hotel cleaner, and eventually house cleaner for families like yours." She nodded toward the Hendersons. I kept a small keyboard in my apartment to practice when I could, but after a while, it became too painful. Each time I played, I remembered everything I had lost. Her fingers stilled on the keys. Until tonight. The silence that followed felt heavy with understanding. Then an older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Blackwell, whose charity foundation was supposedly the beneficiary of tonight's gala. "My dear," she said, her voice wavering with emotion, "our foundation was established to provide arts education to those in need. But I believe we've lost sight of our true purpose over the years. Your story reminds us why the arts matter. They survive even when everything else is taken away." She turned to address the crowd. "Tonight we've witnessed something remarkable. Instead of just writing checks and feeling good about ourselves, we've seen firsthand what our support could mean. I propose we create a special fellowship for artists like Elena, who have been displaced from their home countries." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. For once, these wealthy people seemed genuinely moved, not just performing compassion for social credit. Dr. Reed stepped forward again. "I have connections at the conservatory here. With your permission, Elena, I'd like to arrange an audition. They have a visiting artist program that includes a work visa sponsorship." Elena felt overwhelmed. After years of struggling just to survive, these opportunities seemed too good to be true. "That's very kind," she managed to say, "but I don't know if—" "Excuse me." A tall, distinguished man Elena hadn't noticed before made his way through the crowd. "Lawrence Williams, director of the city's symphony orchestra," he introduced himself, extending his hand to Elena. "I came tonight as Mrs. Blackwell's guest. I wasn't expecting to discover such an extraordinary talent." He handed her his business card. "We're preparing for our winter season. Our principal pianist broke her wrist last week, and we've been scrambling for a replacement. After what I've heard tonight, I'd like to offer you an audition. The position comes with sponsorship for an O1 visa for extraordinary ability in the arts." Elena stared at the card in her hand, unable to believe what was happening. For years she had hidden her talent, buried her dreams, convinced herself that her old life was gone forever. And now, because of a cruel prank that had backfired spectacularly, doors were opening that she thought had been permanently closed. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," Mrs. Henderson urged, surprising everyone, including herself. "And let us help you. It's the least we can do." Mr. Henderson nodded in agreement, looking genuinely chastened by the evening's events. "We have connections that could help with your immigration status, and you're welcome to practice on our piano anytime. It's criminal that it's sat unused for so long." Elena looked around at these people who had never truly seen her before tonight. Their sudden kindness was jarring after months of invisibility. Part of her wanted to reject their help out of pride. But she thought of her father, who had sacrificed everything so she could escape. He wouldn't want her to refuse this chance. "Out of stubbornness, thank you," she said finally. "I would be grateful for your help." The crowd broke into applause again, seemingly pleased with this happy development at their charity gala. Elena knew that for some, this was just another interesting story to tell at their next social event. But others, like Dr. Reed and Mr. Williams, seemed genuinely moved and committed to helping her. Brittany approached the piano tentatively, her earlier arrogance replaced by something like humility. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "What we did was mean. I didn't know. I didn't think. You didn't see me," Elena finished for her. "It's okay. Most people don't." The teenager looked stricken by this simple truth. Would you teach me to play?" she asked suddenly. "I mean really play, not just the basic lessons I had as a kid. Mom and Dad got this piano for me, but I never took it seriously." The request surprised Elena. "You want me to teach? You?" Brittany nodded, looking more genuine than Elena had ever seen her. "Yeah. I never knew it could sound like what you played, like it has feelings." Elena smiled, recognizing the spark of real interest in the girl's eyes. "I'd be happy to teach you if your parents agree." "We'll pay you properly, of course," Mrs. Henderson interjected quickly. "As a piano instructor, not, well, you won't need to clean for us anymore." Elena considered this. Actually, until these other opportunities are certain, I'd appreciate keeping my regular job. But perhaps we could adjust my schedule to include time for lessons. The practicality of this response seemed to surprise the Hendersons, who were used to grand gestures rather than practical considerations. But they nodded in agreement. As the evening continued, Elena found herself the center of attention in a way she hadn't experienced since her performing days. People who had previously looked through her now sought her out for conversation. They asked about her favorite composers, her training, her opinions on modern classical music. They listened to her answers with genuine interest. Mr. Williams stayed by the piano, occasionally asking her to play something specific, assessing her range and style. Dr. Reed made calls to his contacts at the conservatory, speaking enthusiastically about discovering an extraordinary talent. Through it all, Elena felt a strange mix of emotions: joy at playing again, wariness about these sudden offers of help, hope that perhaps her life could change, and grief for all the years lost. The weight of her past hadn't magically disappeared. The trauma of fleeing her home, losing her parents, struggling alone in a new country, all of it still lived inside her. But as midnight approached and she played one final piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece of exquisite beauty and longing, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The simple, cruel joke meant to humiliate her had instead revealed her to herself again. The person she had been wasn't gone after all, just hidden beneath layers of survival and necessity. Her hands still held the same magic they always had. Her heart still spoke through the music. As the final notes of the nocturne faded away, Elena looked up at the gathered faces. No longer strangers who overlooked her, but people who had witnessed something authentic and been changed by it. The evening that had begun with an attempt to make her invisible had instead made her more visible than she had been in years. "Thank you," she said simply, closing the piano lid with gentle reverence. The applause that followed felt like the beginning of something new. The days following the charity gala passed in a blur for Elena. Word of her performance spread quickly through Boston's elite social circles, each retelling making the story more dramatic. By Monday morning, her phone was buzzing with text messages from the Hendersons and calls from numbers she didn't recognize. "You've become quite the sensation," Mrs. Henderson told her when she arrived for work. The woman's tone had changed completely, no longer dismissive but almost deferential. "Lawrence Williams called Robert 3 times yesterday about your audition." Elena set down her cleaning supplies, still not quite believing how her life had changed in just 2 days. "I can still clean today," she offered, falling back on the routine that had defined her existence for so long. Mrs. Henderson waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense, we've hired a service to handle that. You're here for Brittany's first lesson, remember?" The teenager appeared in the doorway looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Hi," she said awkwardly. "I practiced a little yesterday, but I'm really bad." Elena smiled, remembering her own first fumbling attempts at the piano as a child. Everyone is bad at the beginning. That's how learning works. As they moved to the piano, Elena noticed small changes in the Henderson home. Fresh flowers had been placed near the instrument. Sheet music was stacked neatly on a side table. The piano bench had been polished. These people who had treated their grand piano as merely decorative furniture for years were now treating it with respect. The lesson went better than Elena expected. Beneath Brittany's spoiled exterior was a girl with a genuine interest and a good ear. When she managed to play a simple C major scale smoothly, her face lit up with genuine pride, perhaps the first time she'd earned something rather than having it handed to her. After the lesson, Mr. Henderson appeared from his home office. "Elena, do you have a moment? Lawrence Williams is on the phone and would like to speak with you." Elena followed him to his office, still feeling strange about being treated as a guest rather than an employee. Mr. Henderson handed her the phone and stepped out to give her privacy. Another first. "Ms. Morales," Williams' deep voice greeted her. "I've arranged for your audition tomorrow at 2 o'clock if that suits you. Nothing formal. Just come prepared to play 2 or 3 pieces that showcase your range." Thank you, Mr. Williams, I'll be there, Elena replied, her heart racing with both excitement and anxiety. It had been years since she'd performed in a professional context. Excellent. And Dr. Reed has been in touch with the conservatory. They're quite interested in meeting you as well. He paused. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of searching for some of your earlier performances online. There's a recording of your Rachmaninoff with the Vienna Philharmonic that's quite remarkable. Elena felt a pang of nostalgia. That feels like another lifetime. Perhaps, Williams replied, but talent like yours doesn't disappear. It waits. After she hung up, Mr. Henderson returned with a thick envelope. I've spoken with our immigration attorney, he said, looking slightly uncomfortable. These are the forms you'll need for the O1 visa application. He's agreed to handle your case pro bono as part of our foundation's work. Elena accepted the envelope, torn between gratitude and wariness. The Hendersons' sudden generosity felt genuine but also seemed motivated by guilt. Either way, she couldn't afford to reject help that might change her situation. Thank you, she said simply. It's the least we can do, he replied, not quite meeting her eyes. As Elena prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson appeared with a garment bag. For your audition tomorrow, she explained. It's last season, but Valentino is always appropriate. Elena began to protest, but Mrs. Henderson continued. Please, let me do this. What happened at the gala? It wasn't right. We've treated you as invisible for months and then put you in that horrible position as a joke. Her perfectly made-up face showed genuine remorse. I'm trying to make amends. Elena accepted the bag with a nod of thanks. As uncomfortable as their charity made her feel, she understood that the Hendersons were trying to reconcile their guilt in the only way they knew how, with money and connections. That evening in her small apartment, Elena opened the garment bag to find an elegant black dress that probably cost more than she earned in 3 months. She hung it carefully, then sat at her keyboard. The small instrument felt different now, after playing the Hendersons' magnificent grand piano. But she needed to practice for tomorrow. As her fingers moved through scales and arpeggios, warming up muscles that had gone too long without proper use, Elena found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. For years, she had buried her talent, convinced that part of her life was over. She had accepted invisibility as the price of survival. One note had changed everything. One moment of courage, or perhaps desperation, had reopened doors she thought permanently closed. The next day, Elena arrived at Symphony Hall clutching a folder of sheet music she'd printed at the library. The Valentino dress fit perfectly, making her look like the concert pianist she had once been training to become. The security guard directed her to a side entrance where Lawrence Williams was waiting. Right on time, he said warmly. We'll use the rehearsal room. The orchestra members are curious to meet you. Word has spread about your remarkable story. Elena followed him through the labyrinthine backstage area, trying to calm her racing heart. When they entered the rehearsal room, she was surprised to find not just Williams but a small group waiting. Several orchestra members, Dr. Reed from the gala, and 2 people introduced as faculty from the conservatory. Don't be nervous, Williams said, noting her wide eyes. They're just here to listen. The rehearsal room held a beautiful Steinway concert grand. Elena approached it reverently, running her fingers lightly over the keys. This was a serious instrument, far superior even to the Hendersons' piano. Whenever you're ready, Williams said gently. Elena took a deep breath and began with Bach's Prelude in C major, a piece of mathematical precision that would demonstrate her technical foundation. The clean, flowing arpeggios filled the room, and she felt her anxiety melting away as she surrendered to the familiar patterns. She moved next to Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, a piece of emotional depth and technical challenges. As her hands flew over the keys during the allegro, she caught glimpses of the observers leaning forward in their seats, expressions intent. Finally, she played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, the composer whose work had defined her early career with its massive chords and sweeping emotional range. She poured everything into the performance, her lost years, her struggles, her newfound hope. When the final thunderous chords faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the small audience broke into enthusiastic applause. Williams was beaming. Dr. Reed was wiping his eyes. "Extraordinary," said one of the conservatory professors approaching the piano. "Simply extraordinary. We would be honored to have you join our visiting artist program. It includes teaching opportunities as well as performance slots in our concert series." Williams stepped forward. "And we would like to offer you a position as guest soloist for our winter season, with potential for a more permanent arrangement, depending on your visa situation." Elena looked from one face to another, overwhelmed by offers that would have seemed impossible just days ago. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes to both," Dr. Reed suggested with a smile. "The schedules can be arranged to accommodate both opportunities." A woman from the orchestra, introduced as the concertmaster, approached Elena. "My grandmother fled Hungary during the revolution," she said quietly. "She was a violinist who cleaned houses for years before finding her way back to music. Your story resonates with many of us who come from immigrant families." Over the next few weeks, Elena's life transformed. The Henderson family's attorney expedited her visa application with letters of support from the symphony and the conservatory. She continued teaching Brittany, whose initial enthusiasm developed into genuine dedication. The teenager even defended Elena when her friends made snide remarks about their former maid's sudden rise in status. "You don't get it," Elena overheard Brittany telling Ashley. "She's like actually talented, not fake talented like people whose parents just buy them opportunities." The comment revealed a self-awareness that surprised Elena. Perhaps witnessing her journey had given Brittany a glimpse of what genuine accomplishment looked like. 6 months after the fateful gala, Elena stood backstage at Symphony Hall, wearing a borrowed gown and trying to calm her racing heart. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the sold-out crowd. Her debut performance with the symphony had generated unexpected buzz, partly due to her unusual story, which had been featured in the local newspaper. "5 minutes, Ms. Morales," the stage manager informed her. Elena nodded, taking deep breaths. In the front row sat the Hendersons, who had insisted on being patrons for this performance. Brittany had proudly told everyone at school that her piano teacher was performing with the symphony. Mrs. Blackwell had arranged for students from underserved schools to attend the matinee performance tomorrow. Dr. Reed had become a mentor and friend, helping Elena navigate her re-entry into the classical music world. As she waited to take the stage, Elena thought about how a single moment had changed everything. That first note she played at the Hendersons' gala, when she chose dignity over humiliation, courage over fear. She thought about her father, who had sacrificed everything so she could escape to safety, and her mother, who hadn't lived to see this moment. Then Lawrence Williams was introducing her to enthusiastic applause, and Elena was walking onto the stage of Symphony Hall, not as someone invisible but as someone seen and valued for her true gifts. She took her seat at the magnificent Steinway Concert Grand. The orchestra waited for her cue. The audience fell silent in anticipation. Elena placed her hands on the keys, looked up at Williams, and nodded. As she struck the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, she felt a circle closing. The piece she had played in Vienna 8 years ago, before her world collapsed, now marked the beginning of her new life. The rich, melancholy theme filled the hall, and Elena felt tears pricking behind her eyes. But she didn't fight them as she once would have. These were not tears of loss but of homecoming, not to a physical place but to herself. In the audience, Brittany Henderson watched in awe as her former maid transformed on stage into something magnificent. The teenager had never understood what people meant when they talked about being moved by art. Music had always been background noise in her privileged life, something that played while she scrolled through social media or talked with friends. But watching Elena play, seeing how completely she inhabited the music, Brittany finally understood. This wasn't just sound, it was a human spirit made audible. The realization humbled her, making her question what truly mattered in life. As the concerto built toward its famous triumphant finale, Elena felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a cruel joke had led her here, to this moment of vindication and joy. The years of struggle hadn't been erased, but they had been given meaning. They were part of the story that made her performance so powerful. When the final chords resounded through Symphony Hall, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Flowers were brought to the stage. Williams shook her hand with genuine respect. The orchestra members tapped their bows against their music stands, the traditional musicians' tribute to an exceptional performance. Elena stood center stage, accepting the applause with graceful nods. But in her mind, she was back in the Henderson living room, sitting at their piano in her maid's uniform, gathering her courage to play that first note. Sometimes a single note can change a life. Sometimes the path back to yourself begins in the moment you're meant to be most humiliated. Sometimes being seen, truly seen, is all it takes to remember who you are. As Elena took her final bow, she looked out at the sea of faces. Some familiar, most strangers, all connected now through the universal language of music. In that moment, she was neither the celebrated prodigy of her youth nor the invisible maid of recent years. She was simply Elena, finally playing her own composition, again.